If you follow Alberta politics, you may have heard that NDP leader Rachel Notley was kicked out of the legislature this week. To talk more about it is the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me via Skype from Edmonton. Tyler, why don't you explain to our viewers exactly what happened?
Yeah, so the short version is there is some unparliamentary language. The slightly longer version is the UCP has introduced a bill called Bill 22. As part of that legislation, the current elections commissioner, a guy named Lorne Gibson, is going to be losing his job. Now, this is the guy that is investigating some of the leadership campaign issues that happened around the UCP when it first opened up, and he's leveled about a couple $100,000 worth of fines. And so in the legislature, there was a discussion about this, and Jason Nixon, the House Leader and Environment Minister, said nobody's being fired, and Rachel Notley accused Nixon of misleading the House, which is not allowed. It's pretty mild unparliamentary language, but is not allowed. And she refused to apologize, refused to back down, and so the Speaker of the House, Nathan Cooper, had her booted out, and she was not back on Wednesday. She was not yet ready to apologize, perhaps, for what she said.
So she pulled a Don Cherry, is what you're saying? Oh, wait a minute, maybe it's too soon.
Too soon, I suspected. I'm not sure anyone would like the implication of that, but you never know.
Now, Premier Jason Kenney's Fair Deal panel was announced. Tyler, he brought up some controversial subject matter, including Alberta having its own pension plan and police force.
Yeah, so these are all in a lot of ways kind of older ideas. If we cast our minds back to 2001 or so, when the firewall letter was published, this was, Stephen Harper was involved, Ted Morton was involved, all these sort of very old school conservatives from that era wrote this letter, and it contained all these ideas that Alberta could take, all these steps Alberta could take to gain more not so much independence, I guess that's not quite the right word, but power over its own affairs. And this was addressed to Premier Ralph Klein, who was quite publicly not a fan of this. There was a commission that looked into it at the time. They did not a great job, but basically concluded that none of these ideas were any good. And then for 18 years, it only came up now and again in topics of conversation. But these ideas are back on the agenda. So as you said, Alberta pension plan, which would mean withdrawing from the Canada pension plan. There would be other parts such as collecting our own federal income tax, as Quebec does, having more control over immigration. You mentioned the Alberta police force, which is something that Ontario has already done and Quebec has already done, and Alberta could, in theory, end contracts with the RCMP. So there's a whole pile of these issues that Jason Kenney is going to have this panel study and decide whether or not any of them are worth pursuing and taking to the Alberta population in a referendum.
Yeah, and the panel also discussed the opt-out of cost-sharing programs like pharmacare. What would that look like?
Yes, that's right. So it seems to me that is a big ask in this thing. I don't know how a provincial government says, well, we don't want to pay into this thing, so we won't be a part of it. But that is one of the things they're going to look into, is if the Alberta government, if the United Conservatives do not want to administer or pay for a national pharmacare program, they are going to attempt in some fashion to not be a part of that. I haven't the foggiest how that sort of thing would look, but I mean, at the end of the day, I suppose healthcare is a provincial responsibility. So maybe there's some wiggle room there.
There's some budget news, including shutting down various inactive boards and changing housing rules, including being able to build a wood structure over 6 stories tall, Tyler.
Yeah, that one it jumped right off the page at me when looking at it. But it turns out that one is mainly to stay in line with changes to the federal building code. But yes, there will be changes to the building code. You will be able to build a taller wooden structure than is previous. This is a sort of a larger part of the red tape reduction plan the NDP, the UCP is embarking on right now, as well as saving money from various parts of the government that don't really need to be operating anymore. So some of these boards are basically inactive boards, but they still have reporting requirements, for example, that cost a little bit of money. Some of them are just being brought under the auspices of their various ministries. So the board is sort of disappearing, but its functions won't. As we talked about in the beginning, part of this is the ending of Lorne Gibson, the elections commissioner's current role, and moving that into the elections office. So whole pile of different things happening. It's one of those, it's a person can barely keep track of everything that's going on this week.
The farm repeal bill is coming up. Now, this is a story you'll be covering for the National Post, Tyler. Share with our viewers what exactly it's all about.
Right. So viewers will remember Bill 6, the very contentious NDP farm safety bill that put in a bunch of new rules. And the big thing that that one did was that it made farm workers covered by workers' compensation. So if you were a very large farm operation that had private insurance, you had to switch over to workers' compensation board, and all workers had that. Now, what the UCP is proposing is breaking farms into two different classifications. So you'll have a small employer and a large employer. And the small employer is going to be 5 employees or less, not including family members and not including people who work less than 6 months. So it's basically 5 full-time employees, shall we say, or almost an entire year employees that will give it this small designation. And then over that, so 6 people and up, you are a large farm. So these small farms have a whole pile of exemptions. Employment standards will not apply to them, and they will not have to provide insurance or workers' compensation. And that is not the case for the large farm employer. They will have to provide either private insurance or WCB coverage. And they, I believe, have some labor stuff that remains a little bit similar labor rules in place as they are now. Now, the other thing that is happening, it's a massive bill, is the thing, and it's also going to end labor relations stuff on farms. So if you were a farm worker who was keen on joining a union, unionizing, that will no longer be allowed. So there's some changes there as well, some changes to occupational health and safety. Massive piece of legislation with wide-ranging implications and some of them aren't even sort of clear yet. Those will come later through ministerial regulations and things like that to know exactly what all this is going to look like.
Premier Kenney's also been doing a little bit of traveling this week, this time in Texas, Tyler. Texas. Wait a minute. No. Kenney is doing more of his Invest in Alberta speech. Is it actually helping?
It's a great question. I don't know if we've seen a pile of money flood in yet. I think you could maybe point to the TELUS deal from some months ago as a place where progress was made. The nitty-gritty of that is escaping me a few months down the road, but that might be an example. But yes, Kenney is on the road in Texas. The conspiracy theorist in me wants to say it's very, very good timing because he would be having a rough week if he was in town. So he picked a good time to be away to some extent. But yes, he is speaking with CEOs and investment type people in Texas. He said in a video update posted to Twitter a little bit earlier that Texas is actually the second largest market for Alberta exports after Illinois, of all things, of all places. So yeah, so he's off doing his speeches, talking about red tape reduction, corporate tax cut, all this stuff that you and I have talked about before. He is on the road in Houston and Dallas and one or two other places, given that speech and hoping to drum up some investment.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently shuffled his cabinet, Tyler. Former TV personality Seamus O'Regan is the new Natural Resources Minister, so he'll be getting to know Mr. Kenney quite well.
I would imagine so, yeah. There's definitely some new faces around the cabinet table. The other one that people might be interested in is Environment Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, who replaces Catherine McKenna in that role. But yes, those are probably the two members of Parliament that are, on one hand going to get an earful from Premier Jason Kenney over the next several months and who will have their hands full on these files. I don't think anyone would envy those files, but Wilkinson is a Saskatchewan boy, lives in Vancouver now, but grew up in Saskatchewan, so perhaps he brings a little bit of that sensibility to the role. And Seamus O'Regan, I believe, is from Newfoundland, which has its own resource concerns and resource development issues. So if I was a real optimist on this, I would maybe say that these are people who might have some understanding of what the concerns are out here right now.
A Liberal MP who's been battling cancer, Jim CARR, has been tasked with bridging the gap between Ottawa and the Prairies. Tell me more.
Yeah, that's almost as much as we know. Jim CARR is one of the lone Liberals sort of west of Thunder Bay, really. So he's a Winnipeg member of Parliament, and he will be attempting to bring to Trudeau, bring to the federal government, sort of some of the Western perspective on these issues. As people remember, there are no Liberal members of Parliament from Saskatchewan or Alberta, and even large chunks of BC don't have a Liberal. So Jim Carr, who as far as I'm aware is a reasonably well-respected guy, reasonably well-liked guy, which I think probably goes a long way in these sorts of roles, been around for a long time. Surely he knows Jason Kenney, probably personally from when they were both in Parliament together. So that's going to be his job to listen and report back. We will see how well that works out. This is alongside, of course, other people who've been appointed in some fashion. Anne McClellan is involved in this sort of Western panel thing that's going on. So, perhaps regardless of what happens or what tangibly happens, I think that Trudeau can point to this as something concrete that he's done to say, look, I am actually trying to listen. Whether or not that leads to some of the changes that people out here would like to see is maybe a separate question.
The fact that the Liberals were shut out of Alberta and Saskatchewan, no MPs elected here, how much will that hurt the relationship then between Ottawa and the Prairies?
Yeah, a lot of people have raised that as a concern over the past several weeks, and I have to admit that I'm not especially concerned about it. And not because I'm sort of like, you got to dance with the one who brung you sort of thing. It's not that I'm not sympathetic to that point, but it is that we have representatives in Ottawa. They just happen to be Conservatives and one New Democrat. And the role of all backbench MPs, whether in opposition or on the government side, I think, is to hold the government to account. So given that, I would expect that the people who we've sent there will represent us to the best of our ability. And I also don't think there's any real indication that having a Liberal MP would actually change things all that substantially. Premier Jason Kenney and Premier Scott Moe have been very vocal about what they want. Albertans can write to all their members of Parliament. They can write to the Prime Minister. I think there are other ways to make our voices heard and raise concerns. Without, as came up at the Manning Conference recently, without whining too much about it.
Some of your brothers and sisters in the print media recently lost their jobs. As the axe fell on the Toronto Star, hundreds of people lost their jobs. Tyler, it looks like the media landscape is changing once again.
Yeah, it's this story that never ends in a lot of ways. I mean, I've only been in this industry for 5 or 6 years, and this is, gosh, it feels like this happens every year. But yeah, so the Star Metro papers, which are in Halifax, Edmonton, Calgary, and Vancouver, I don't think I'm missing any, will be ceasing print operations. So they are basically laying off the reporters in those spaces, and I believe there are also some job losses on sort of the printing and design side of these operations. So that's where that's at. I happen to be out for drinks actually with the Edmonton folks, and they've got a few weeks of work left. They sort of wrap up between December 20th and the end of the year, and then they'll Merry Christmas, I guess, to our colleagues at the Star.
Hopefully they can find work real soon somewhere else. The Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, thanks a lot for your time from Edmonton.
Thanks, Al.